Alright guys, we're going to go over this article today, pretty important article. It says, I work for N.S.A. We cannot afford to lose the digital revolution. Now this is over on the NewYorkTimes.com. And I apologize guys that I haven't been putting videos out. Right now my main concern is getting finances together somehow or another to get my ankle surgery done so I can get back to living a life and get back to working and get back to doing what I got to do to make an income. So that's been my focus guys, so I'm going to be off and on with videos. I apologize, just deal with me for a little while I get everything worked out, and then we'll get back to kind of a normal schedule of some sort once I got everything worked out and back to working. So here we go. I work for N.S.A. We cannot afford to lose the digital revolution. Technology is about to upend our entire national security infrastructure. Quantum computing, guys, it has to come. It's already here, but it has to be implemented. Now, this was September 10th, 2019, and this is what it has to say. We're going to go through the whole article together. The National Security Operations Center occupies a large windowless room bathed in blue light on the third floor of National Security Agency's headquarters outside of Washington. For the past 46 years, around the clock, without a single interruption, a team of senior military and intelligence officials has staffed this national security nerve center. The center's senior operations officer is surrounded by glowing high-definition monitors showing information about things like Pentagon computer networks, military and civilian air traffic in the Middle East, and video feeds from drones in Afghanistan. The officer is authorized to notify the president any time of the day or night of a critical threat. Just down a staircase outside the Operations Center in the Defense Special Missile and Aeronautics Center, which keeps track of missile and satellite launches by China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, and other countries. If North Korea was ever to launch an intercontinental ballistic missile towards Los Angeles, those keeping watch might have half an hour or more between the time of detection to the time the missile would land at the target. At least in theory, that is enough time to alert the operations centers to 2 floors above and alert the military to shoot down the missile. But these early warning centers have no ability to issue a warning to the president that would stop a cyber attack that takes down a regional or national power grid, or to intercept a hypersonic cruise missile launched from Russia or China. The cyber attack can be detected only upon occurrence, and the hypersonic missile only seconds or at best minutes before attack. And even if we could detect a missile flying at low altitudes at 20 times the speed of sound, we have no way of stopping it. The threats of cyber attack and hypersonic missiles are 2 examples of easily foreseeable challenges to our national security posed by rapidly developing technology. It's all about the technology, guys. We are moving at a pace with technology now that supersedes any advancement that we've had in the past. And so technology is getting ahead of us, literally. So this is why this article is so important. It is by no means certain that we will be able to cope with those 2 threats, let alone the even more complicated and unknown challenges presented by the general onrush of technology. The digital revolution, or so-called 4th Industrial Revolution, that will be our future for the next few decades. The digital revolution has urgent and profound implications for our federal national security agencies. It is almost impossible to overstate the challenges. If anything, we run the risk of thinking too conventionally about the future. The short period of time our nation has to prepare for the effects of this revolution is already upon us, and it could not come at a more perilous and complicated time for the National Security Agency, Central Intelligence Agency, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Defense Intelligence Agency, FBI, and other components of intelligence community. The immediacy and specificity of the war on terror following the September 11 attacks permitted the intelligence community to reorient itself relatively quickly and effectively from the Cold War and its immediate aftermath. But the intelligence community and its allies, who rely on one another for information sharing, must now adapt to adversaries with new capabilities, principally China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, each of which presents different and complex threats while still not forsaking the counterterrorism mission. Gearing up to deal with those new adversaries, which do not necessarily present merely conventional military threats, is itself a daunting challenge and one that must be undertaken immediately and for at least the next decade or two. But that is precisely when we must put in place a new foundation for dealing with the even more profound and enduring implications of the digital revolution. And that's the revolution you guys are in. This is the fourth revolution. That revolution will sweep through all aspects of our society so powerfully that our only chance of effectively grappling with its consequences will lie in taking bold steps in the relatively near term. In short, our attention must turn to a far more complex set of threats of multiple dimensions enabled by the digital revolution. Now, that word dimensions there is very important, guys. It has double meaning. While the potential consequences are less catastrophic than nuclear war, they are nonetheless deeply threatening in a range of ways we will have trouble countering. There are four key implications of this revolution that policymakers in the national security sector will need to address. The first is the unprecedented scale and pace of technological change will outstrip our ability to effectively adapt to it. Second, we will be in a world of ceaseless and pervasive cyber insecurity and cyber conflict against nation states, businesses, and individuals. Third, the flood of data about human and machine activity will put such extraordinary economic and political power in the hands of the private sector that it will transform the fundamental relationship, at least in the Western world, between government and the private sector. So you're going to see that technology is going to have a fluid influence between the federal, that's the federal government, that's that corporation, and then the private citizen, that's you and me that are citizens of the state. Now, I haven't got into this in detail in the videos yet, but basically what they've done is they've convinced everyone that they are a U.S. citizen, a United States citizen, and so convincing the people place themselves into the federal territories, that is Guam, Puerto Rico, District of Columbia, any federal lands such as national parks and that kind of stuff, not into the private lands or the private sector, but have moved people into those districts that the federal government controls and makes laws, statutes, and all those things. Okay, that's a U.S. citizen. We are all state citizens, citizens of our state, which are independent nations, all unified under the federal government, which has laws that govern the federal territories, which have nothing to do with the actual nation state that you live in. So you should be a state citizen and a private citizen and have nothing to do with the U.S. citizenship. Nevertheless, I do believe all of what I just said is going to be worked out in due time, because you got to remember that the president is the president of the republic, the president of the corporation, and the commander-in-chief of the federal military. So he plays three roles, and that's what's keeping everybody confused. But I believe that Trump is operating mainly under the republic and is bringing the republic or restoring the republic. The republic only lasted literally a few years before it was overtaken. Eventually I'll get around to making those videos, guys. Just right now, just don't have the time. I'm on the phone a lot. I'm on the internet a lot trying to get things worked out for my ankle. Private sector. Now finally, and perhaps most ominously, the digital revolution has the potential for a pernicious effect on the very legitimacy and the stability of our governmental and societal structures. What I offer here is more of a sketch than a finished painting. Our national policymakers and the future leaders of those agencies will be responsible for addressing these foreseeable challenges and ultimately finding solutions. While these trends have been extensively discussed in the press, academia, and the technical world, there has been far less attention devoted to understanding the combined effect the trends will have on the various agencies that help keep our nation safe. I hope to rectify that shortfall. So that's the point of this article. We all sense that we are on the cusp of unimaginable technological changes. Cell phones and the internet seem of such manifest utility that we take them for granted. But that is only because they have become so central to our daily lives, not because they have been around forever. Indeed, as we are often reminded, Google started in 1998, YouTube is only 14 years old, and the iPhone is merely 12 years old. The digital revolution thus far is distinguished by its ability to become ubiquitous in our daily personal and commercial lives in an astonishingly rapid time, a time frame that is really without precedent. Other transformational technologies such as railroads, electricity, radio, television, automobiles, and airplanes all took several decades before they reached that comparable level of ambiguity. Society had the time to sort out the norms, rules, and laws governing those technologies and the respective roles of government and the private sector. Consider, for example, the lag between the advent of the first useful automobile in the late 19th century and the late 1960s, when safety features became truly significant and mandatory. By contrast, today, just a dozen years after Facebook became a, quote, thing in our lives, we are forced to grapple with whether and how we should regulate hateful posting and mendacious foreign electoral influence on social media platforms. Facial recognition technology has in just a handful of years become sufficiently accurate as to be useful and thus more common, but its persistent imperfections have led to a confused spate of lawsuits and statutes seeking to regulate its use. We are far from figuring out its proper role in our society. Now, we have China over there that uses it in their system, which is based on merit, basically, so that they can shut you down and shut you up if they need to, and all these kinds of things. But facial recognition and biometrics and all these things, these newest technologies that are available, in some cases are being used for great and wonderful purposes, and in other cases for nefarious and bad things. So you've got to look at the whole thing. And at this point, guys, in time, this facial recognition and biometric technology, we don't know what its proper role in society is at this point. Now, again, it's being used in different ways, some beneficial and some that are detrimental. But at this point, we really don't know how we can use it for all people to benefit from those new technologies. And it's important that you guys understand this, that this is something that has to be worked out, okay? It can go both ways, or it can go down that neutral path, and the neutral path is the best path. Always will be. But just understand that at this time, we don't know its proper role. So the windows for how long it takes for technology to shape society, and more pertinent to this discussion, how long it takes for us to sort out the associated challenges, are becoming almost impossibly compressed. So when the other technologies such as coal, such as gasoline, such as electricity, TV, radio, these things happened over broad periods of times, and we were able to cope with them and understand them and make the statutes and make the laws and do what we had to do to keep things safe and working and properly functioning and all these kinds of things. But with modern technology, it's happening at such a rapid pace that that time period has been compressed down to mere months or years, literally usually less than a year, instead of over a decade of time. So you have a serious situation taking place as this technologies begin to advance, especially with machine learning and all the other things that we have with AI and so forth and so on. So the time compression for our society and ultimately our national security agencies to deal with these challenges is but one aspect of the problem. The sheer amount of data that will be generated by individual and commercial activities with the quote Internet of Things end quote and 5G cellular connectivity is incomprehensible and will require entirely new ways of rendering that data meaningful to agencies whose mission is to discern threats to national security. Now, I know everyone has this bad concept of 5G. I get it. I understand it. I know the narrative that's out there that is trying to get people convinced that this thing is detrimental, causes cancer, disease, it's used as a weapon to kill or to program or mind control, and so forth and so on. Look, guys, every technology out there, including 3G and 4G, can be used the same way. Okay, what you got to understand is who is operating that technology and for what purpose is what determines if it's a good technology for a good use or a good technology used for a bad use to kill and to destroy. It all depends on who's head over that and what it is being used for. 5G technology on its own does not kill. It does not create radiation. It does not create cancer. It cannot control your mind and all these things. Okay, you got to bring in the chemtrails into that. You got to bring Dorian into that. And I'm not talking about the hurricane. I'm talking about the space observatory up there that they use and all the other elements that they are using, such as the HARP stations up in Alaska, Puerto Rico, and all over the earth, and the ELF, the electro, not ELF. What is it? Anyway, I can't think of it. My mind's gone blank. But the towers that are all spread throughout the United States and throughout the world that are sending signals across the Earth level. So you got signals in the upper atmosphere, stratosphere, bouncing off of the firmament, and so forth and so on. And then you got the ELF waves down here on the ground level. All these things interconnect in order to create mind control and all these things, okay? And so it's how the technology is used. And I know at some point, sooner or later, I'll get around to making a video on 5G, but, you know, videos take a long time to make, guys, and so when I get to it, I can get to it. You know what I'm saying? So just hang in there on that. Just understand there's always a good and a bad side to every technology. There's a good side to electricity, but you can use electricity to fry and kill a person as well. It's called death by electrocution. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the technology is. Microwaves can be great for heating up food. What does it do? It sends energy in microwave wavelengths into the food particles and heats water. It causes the water molecules to rapidly move, and which cooks the product. It doesn't destroy the product like people claim it does. It's all about water. Okay, everything that goes on in that microwave is about the movement of water and heating by water. But nevertheless, you can use the same technology, microwave technology, to fry a human being in a crowd that's out of hand. Okay? Again, every technology has a good and a bad side. It all depends on who has control of it. That matters. And the 5G that was coming was there to destroy us and to mind control us and do all sorts of incomprehensible things. So, okay, so what do we have here? We will need new technologies and systems to capture, analyze, and store this data. Now, you're talking about massive, massive, massive amounts of data. Okay? Every human being on the earth having cell phones, laptops, whatever devices they have. Not only that, but your refrigerator will have the ability to communicate with your cell phone or other devices in your house, and your thermostats, your oven, your everything. Everything will be interconnected to where you literally the Jetsons age, okay, where you hit a button and your car folds up and you put your suitcase in the slot and go on about your business. Things like that. You're talking about unimaginable amounts of data. Huge. That the networks are currently not capable. Quantum computing is an absolute necessity of the future. Obviously, that will require enormous investments by the United States and its allies to upgrade national security and surveillance systems. Will Western liberal democracies, already straining under the combined demands of decaying civil infrastructure aging populations, upgrading militaries, and so on be able to afford these investments? Given that there is no specific forcing event to require greater resources, but rather a trend, history suggests that we will appreciate the seriousness of the underinvestment only when a crisis has occurred. So with everything that's going on, are we going to even be financially capable of dealing with what's coming? Okay, we're having to rebuild our military because of what Obama and Bush and Clinton and all them guys did, and we're having to rebuild everything. We're having to reestablish our republic because they've taken over with an illusionary corporation, and all these kinds of things have to be dealt with. At the same time, we've got to deal with this coming technological advance that's going to happen so rapidly and so quickly that quantum computing is going to become absolutely a necessity, guys. And this is the point I'm trying to get at. This article is going to go over several points, but this is the point I'm trying to get at. We already have quantum computing. Okay, that's what D-Wave is on the Black Hat side, and all sorts of other things. That's quantum computing. That's what that's all about. But nevertheless, let's keep on going. Just understand quantum computing is going to become very important. That approach might be a barely acceptable way for our society and government to address social ills and decaying infrastructure, which are slower moving problems, where with enough resources one might catch up. But the same approach could well be disastrous when addressing rapidly evolving technological matters, especially where national security is at stake. Without such investment, our national security agencies risk becoming profoundly less effective or marginalized. Now, you understand that, for example, Russia and China both have hypersonic missiles. These are missiles that travel at very low altitude, so they're hard to detect with radar and other technologies, and they are traveling so fast that you only have a limited amount of time to react in order to take that missile out before it hits its target. You're talking about speeds now that were incomprehensible just 20, 30, 40 years ago. Okay, you're talking about technology advancing at rates that right now you're not fully comprehending. Okay, just think about how quickly we went from rotary phones where you had to take your finger, stick it in the hole, and dial, and stick it in like the one, and then swing that thing all the way around, and that's how you make your phone call, dial your number with a rotary on a phone. To today, everyone's got a phone on them. No matter where they're at, they're in communication with everybody, no matter where they are on the earth, unless they just happen to be in one of the areas where there is no cell coverage. While extraordinary levels of new investment will be required to deal with the sheer quantity of data, that alone will not be sufficient. It is futile to believe that we will be able to spend our way to success. Rather, we will need to couple large investment with entirely new ways of approaching how we collect, manage, and make sense of this data. One key aspect of any such new approach will be a heavy reliance on machine learning and artificial intelligence. We thought wrestling with the challenges of the Fourth Amendment in addressing electronic surveillance over the past few decades was complicated and contentious, but setting norms for AI will surely be even more fraught with difficulty. The stakes are much higher, given that AI will be intrinsic to determinations and decisions of almost every aspect of our personal, professional, and commercial lives. AI opens up the possibility of rendering intelligible for national security purpose that ocean of data. But if misused, or even if not thoroughly understood, AI can yield nefarious and corrupting results for our society. Since AI is still relatively nascent, our surveillance and analytic resources are not well positioned to deeply understand how adversaries might be using it in the future. The range of novel issues is daunting. For example, we will need to understand how to defend our analytic system against data poisoning, in which an adversary can feed misinformation to AI systems to corrupt or defeat them, such as causing a driverless car to ignore a stop sign. And we've seen this type of use of feeding misinformation into vehicles, such as the attempts to take out the motor, the president in his vehicle, and all these kinds of things as he's traveling between locations. And we've seen these vehicles go out of control. Wrecks happen all around the motor cage or motor thing that the president's involved in. So we've seen this technology. We've also seen it used in bringing down airplanes and these kinds of things. So this is the type of stuff that they're talking about. Unlike the electronic digital computers we have used for over a half a century, quantum computers are based on a fundamentally different concept, relying not on simple on-off switches or on and off states of electricity, but on the complex properties of atomic and subatomic particles. One strategic benefit is that quantum computing will enable something that even our current supercomputers cannot do: crack strong encryption of the type that now protects our commercial financial type transactions, our weapon systems, and government secret communications. Now, what they're saying here is that quantum computing, when it as it becomes more and more available, not just to the governments and to the big giants that we call corporations today, but to get down to the private everyday citizen of the various states of the Union and nation states all over the earth, you're talking about going from modern day computers, where the best encryption software that we have today that can take a hacker anywhere from a couple days to several months to hack, because of the encryption is so great, that once these quantum computers come in, that what took the hacker 2, 3, 4, 5 months to hack, well, they would be able to hack within a matter of a half a second with a quantum computer. That's the difference. So in other words, all weapon systems are open to that country that has the quantum computer. All financial transactions are open to the people that have the quantum computer. The quantum computer gives you an advantage like nothing in the history of the nations. China's publicly announced 2030 goal is to develop a high-performing quantum computer, which should have the decryption ability. Imagine the havoc that could create. Imagine the overwhelming leverage that the winner would have. Such a decryption ability could render the military capabilities of the loser almost irrelevant, and its economy overturned. The analogy of the post-war world in which there was only one nuclear power hints at the type of The analogy of the post-war world in which there was only one nuclear power hints at the type of unilateral dominance that might be possible for the quantum computing victor. But it is not apt here. Even with a nuclear monopoly, there were very real limits on utilizing that capability, but not so with the unilateral capability to decrypt, and thus to understand and perhaps to interfere with or destroy the entire digital existence of an adversary country. So basically, guys, whoever masters the quantum computing first, basically is the new world power. They can render entire nations worthless and incapable of fighting, because they can shut down the entire financial systems, the military systems, and every other systems, because the encryption, the toughest, greatest, most powerful encryption systems of today that take months or even years to hack, would be hacked in a matter of half a second, or 1/3 of a second, or one millionth of a second. I mean, quantum computing is completely and utterly different. You don't have just an on and off state, but you have in between states and all sorts of unlimited possibilities, which eventually narrow it down to one legitimate, correct way, and break through these encryptions that we have today. So these whoever gets the quantum computer and technology mastered first is going to be the new world power. Now, we know China's working on them, the United States working on them, Russia's working on them. All of the major powers are steadily working on them. We know places like Google, IBM, and Facebook and so forth have quantum computing already. They're already there. They're on the second and fourth generations of them. So, anyways, the strategic advantage here would be for one country to surreptitiously acquire such a capability and maintain it for perhaps several years or more. Other countries would not realize that everything from their weapon systems to financial transactions would be vulnerable during that period, and that would include not only current activity but also the historic encrypted communications collected and retained by the winner in anticipation of this very capability. So, as the White Hats got control of quantum computing and they brought this quantum financial system up, it was tracking the Black Hats in every operation that they were doing without them even being aware of the technology there, tracking them and keeping up with them. See, this was their fall, is that they didn't understand the quantum sides of things. They do because they were involved in it, but they didn't realize that the White Hats were running operations side by side, and that today they are already being tracked because the quantum financial system is running side by side with all the various financial systems of the earth and the different central banks and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and all the other stuff. Indeed, one of the strategies yet to be developed involves the paradox of how a country with such capability could exploit it without revealing the capability's existence. Moreover, shifting to quantum-resistant algorithms and encryption is theoretical and thus uncertain, but will surely be expensive and a decades-long endeavor. Over the past several decades, the intelligence community has built up an extraordinary capability to understand the military doctrines and weapon systems of Russia and China. That will still be relevant, but there is now a fundamentally new additional requirement. Under the best of circumstances, it would take many years to develop comparable levels of expertise about those countries' use of AI, quantum computing, or other novel technologies. Such technologies range from hypersonic missiles, which Russia and China are racing to develop, with the potential to upend the entire global balance of power, to synthetic biology and genetic manipulation, with the potential to create new biological weapons or immunities. Our national security sector does not have an extensive history of marrying intelligence insight and analysis with deep technical expertise across a wide range of scientific disciplines. That might not, however, be the limiting factor. It is by no means assured that our national security sector will be able to attract, on a sufficient scale, the scarce engineering, mathematical, and scientific talent that would supply the necessary expertise. That challenge will require investment, enlightenment, strategic management, and an innovative approach to luring a different type of expert out of the private sector into government. Meeting this challenge will require a great reliance in general on the private sector. Again, you're going to see that the balance of power is going to become from the governments down to the people as this technology moves forward. A lot of the technologies that the governments are using today are now available to the everyday individual on the earth today. So it's going to be a continual thing. Meeting this challenge will require a greater reliance in general on the private sector, since government alone does not possess the requisite expertise. A large portion of the intelligence community's experts on the military capabilities and plans of Russia and China joined government during the Reagan administration. Other experts on counterterrorism and new technology burnished their technical skills following the September 11th attacks. Many of those experts are nearing retirement or have already left to join an attractive private sector. With millennials believing that technology in the private sector now allows them to help change the world, previously the idea of a mission had been largely the province of public service. It is not clear that the intelligence community will be able to attract and retain the necessary talent needed to make sense of how our adversaries will make use of the new technology. In short, while important work has been done in examining and laying the foundations for the critical role new technologies will play in national security, much more needs to be done. We must ask whether our defense and national security establishments are in a position, financial and technical, to succeed in this critical technologies that could either solidify our continued position as a leading global power or reduce us to a clearly subordinate role. We are talking about national initiatives that collectively will dwarf the effort to put a man on the moon. So this is not a very small matter. This is a very large, broad matter that is very critical and important to every nation on the earth. This technology advancements that we're going through is moving so rapidly that we've got to be in a position to stay as a leader in this technological advancement, in this technological revolution. Bluntly put, there are few signs that our society overall and our political leaders have fully embraced the challenge or appreciate the risks of failure. All of this technological innovation will surely bring significant societal benefits, perhaps most noticeably in the area of healthcare and genetic engineering, but it will also increase, to use a hackneyed but useful term, the attack surface for cyber mischief. This takes us to the second implication of the digital revolution. We must prepare for a world of incessant, relentless, and omnipresent cyber conflict in not only our national security and defense systems, where we are already used to that conflict, but also, more significantly, every aspect of our daily and commercial lives. The sensors, systems, networks, algorithms, and machines that will empower our new lives, whether healthcare, implants, driverless cars, pilotless aircraft, or food safety protections, again, think the Jetsons, that's where we're headed, will all be part of the Internet of Things. One consequence is that the current division between cyber defense, think firewalls, penetration testing, and cyber hygiene, and supply chain risk management, think of the assessment of equipment, manufacturing, component assurance, and availability of surveillance concerns and equipment, will be eliminated, with everyone concerned with the holistic sanctity of equipment and software to achieve the well-recognized triad of availability, security, and integrity. The 40-odd nation-states that today have offensive cyber capabilities will seem a quaint, historic artifact when sophisticated tools for cyber mischief are in the hands of not only every nation-state but also common criminals around the earth. While most nation-states might be careful to limit their cyber effects to economic theft and espionage, pre-battle positioning of beacons and other malware, mischievous interference with elections and public opinion, all below levels that cause significant physical damage to infrastructure or physical harm to humans, and thus below at least what we currently think of as the threshold for an act of war. There is no guarantee that all nations will exercise such care, nor that criminals would be deterred. Consider how North Korea seems to be able to operate with relative impunity in cyberspace, knowing that it is unlikely to provoke an armed attack partly because of its perceived willingness to retaliate in ways that would impose unacceptable consequences on Western society. Multiply that dynamic across a dozen or more countries or international terrorists or criminal gangs, and we are now faced with an entirely different national security threat. To be sure, our nation has set forth its cyber strategies and continues to refine its offensive and defensive doctrines in cyberspace, but nearly every expert would concede more needs to be done. The question is whether we will be able to do it in time, since the threat is coming at us with the speed and force of a tsunami. The simple fact of the matter is that no nation has yet devised an effective solution to the conundrum of how to respond in a definitive and dispositive way to another nation-state's malicious cyber activity. Whole of government approaches, economic sanctions, judicial prosecutions, and offensive cyber response below the war threshold, while essential and appropriate, have not been enough to stop cyber malevolence. In short, the problem is going to get worse before it gets better. In all probability, it will get better, not because we develop more effective deterrence, although threats of cyber retaliation and imposition of other burdens clearly do play a key role here, at least with our nation states, but because we develop greater resilience and more impervious defenses, and the full realization of that may be a decade away. In the meantime, our national security agencies will be confronted with the political imperatives in our democracies of responding, at least in some way, to cyber threats. Among other things, our citizens and businesses will have to accept that cyber malevolence is a persistent threat, not a war to be won or a disease to be cured. Moreover, since the threat is ignorant of sovereign boundaries, agencies charged with cyber protection will be required to work with many others around the earth, perhaps including those of adversary or competitor nations, creating new complexities. At a minimum, the worldwide cyber threat will put a premium on trusted relations among the Five Eyes, the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and other like-minded nations to facilitate working together to counteract malevolent activity that can span the earth in seconds. Even among such long-term cohesive arrangements as the Five Eye Alliance, unity of effort in cyberspace is not assured, as witnessed recently by deferring approaches to the risk posed by Huawei's equipment in 5G networks. And you guys remember the big deal where Trump basically put a ban on them and all this other stuff because of what they were doing with their 5G technologies. The third implication of the digital revolution is that the balance between government and the private sector will be altered in a profound way. That in turn is the inescapable product of three factors: cyber vulnerability affecting every element of the private sector. No longer are targets arguably limited to military assets. The general flood of data unleashed by the digital revolution that will be created in the hands of private enterprise, and a response to a rising China, whose strategic technology goals pose a unique threat that directly implicates the private sector. Even without, now understand, we are dealing with China. That's what we're doing right now. That's why we're doing the sanctions on them. That's why we're putting the tariffs on them. That's why we're doing everything we're doing, is we're going to crush the economy of China and bring them down in that way. That is the deep state that is within China, not necessarily the people. Even without considering the challenges presented by China, there are at least two related manifestations of how the government-private sector balance has changed and will change. First, the government no longer possesses the lead in complex technology, at least in many areas relevant to national security. First, the government no longer possesses the lead in complex technology, at least in many areas relevant to national security. Arguably, the most powerful computing and sophisticated algorithm development now occurs not in the Pentagon or the N.S.A., but in university research labs and in the Google and Amazons of the commercial world. To be sure, the government still maintains its superiority in important areas ranging from nuclear energy to cryptography. Even apart from the issue of which sector has the technological edge, there is the simple fact that the digital revolution has brought astonishing capabilities to anyone who has a smartphone, who can now download a facial recognition app, a malicious cyber tool, or some other capability that formerly was the exclusive province of government. So what you're seeing now is that it's bringing government capabilities down to the private sector. Second, the private sector will have many more times the quantity of data about individuals and commercial activity than the governments could ever obtain. The larger antivirus vendors, with their sensors connected to their global corporate clients, already know more at any given moment about the state of networks around the world than does any government agency. Businesses in the services, retailing, industrial, and other sectors will have more global sensor and applications detecting cyber traffic, collecting behavioral patterns, amassing personal data, and so on, than even the most surveillance-oriented nation could ever hope to have. And now that's why these lawsuits against these giants that are in the land these days, which is like Google, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, is all now beginning to take place, so that we can begin to control that basically these corporations are coming in and basically controlling the course of events of humanity based on their ability to subliminally make suggestions to you and do all sorts of other things, such as track what you do, what your interests are, everything about you, putting you into a digital world, and all these different kinds of things are all being done in the commercial realm, or in the what would be considered the private sector, separated from the federal government. And so, and understand, guys, you've been dealing with corporations from the beginning. I mean, who was in the United States when we were trying to get all this put together? The East India Trading Company, right? A company of Great Britain. It was a corporation that had its own military and everything else. You know, very, very powerful corporations, and you're still dealing with that to this day with Google and Facebook and so forth and so on. The fact that private satellite imagery companies have displaced the monopoly that the national geospatial intelligence agencies used to have is merely a harbinger of how the private sector will be the collector and repository of key information about our locations, our consumption patterns, our communications, in short, about everything. As the owners of physical infrastructure learned following the September 11 terrorist attacks, when our everyday lives rely on the security of assets and services held in the private sector, commercial owners will be expected to take steps to protect society. We are clearly witnessing the same imbuing of social responsibility into how the digital revolution's data will be handled. Personal data needs to be safeguarded so that it does not fall into the wrong hands. It needs to be made accurate so that inaccurate results are not generated from its use, and it needs to be used in ways that do not violate our notions of privacy and proper use. Those are not duties originating within the commercial world, but will be increasingly imposed by society. And just understand, guys, what I see coming personally. Now, this may not happen, but it most likely will. Is that you're going to have a restored republic, a new republic with new documents such as a new Declaration of Independence, a new Constitution, a new everything, and that's going to include the cyber world, digital data, and all these other things that's going to bring about the freedom of mankind against the ruling governments. Like when I say things like in my video, like I do, such as, you know, you're talking about a future that you've never even considered before, that your mind can't yet begin to comprehend, because it's not comprehensible. The future is completely different than anything of the past that we are aware of. There's nothing new under the sun, so this has happened in the past, but not in the past that we are, quote, aware of, okay? That's the difference. So you're talking about a whole new future, unlike anything ever experienced. In fact, it could very well be unlike anything ever experienced, including all the cycles of time, because we're going into an age of righteousness. As for the safeguarding, many would argue that governments cannot and should not be relied on to prevent and defend against every cyber threat to the private sector, even from a nation state. Such threats are not the same as an armed attack, but that leaves the private sector frustrated and underdefended. Hacking back is often impossible and generally illegal. National security agencies will need to diffuse the frustration and find an effective path for collaboration with the private sector to mitigate cyber threats. The only practical solution is for the private sector to assume a greater burden in this area, but with the active support of the national security agencies. We are still struggling to find an effective solution to the competing desires for the private sector to obtain classified information about cyber threats and for government to obtain detailed information about cyber intrusions into corporate networks. Both sides have legitimate reasons to keep their information secret, but ultimately we all realize that will not yield an effective outcome. Attribution solutions will require the private sector to be more forthcoming about network breaches. Indeed, the private sector should have a greater responsibility to collect, analyze, and retain all this new data and to make it available with appropriate safeguards to the government for national security purposes. But even safeguards will not completely allay a variety of privacy and liability concerns. Until recently, at least in the United States, our notions of privacy have been rooted in the Fourth Amendment's delineation of the federal government's powers vis-a-vis the individual citizen. But what do our nation's notions of privacy mean anywhere when Amazon, Google, Apple, Microsoft, Facebook, and so on already know so much about you? We now see increasing pressure in Congress to regulate in this area. To be sure, this article is not advocating any particular approach, much less suggesting greater surveillance powers, but it is hard to escape the conclusion that we will need to recalibrate the balance in this area of data privacy between the government and the private sector. National security agencies should affirmatively contribute to the public disclosure about the recalibration. The challenge for these agencies will be to find the right approach to working with the private sector to obtain the data needed to fulfill their vital missions in a manner that fits our values and cultures. Of course, there is another path, and it is the one taken by authoritarian regimes around the world. China's approach is to have all that data reside in the central government, in a vast databank of personally identifying information about its citizens, from iris to facial recognition to DNA data. That is antithetical to our values. So you got one example is China, who's again doing the merit system and using facial recognition and biological recognition, DNA recognition, all the other stuff. Then you've got our concept of thing, which is the absolute, as limited as possible government, and the people reign and rule. So how do you bring all this into our situation where we are the sovereigns of the nation and the government is limited and is there to do our will and to keep us protected in whatever way we tell them to do it? But it is equally true that to keep our society safe, those charged with that mission will need some access to that data, absent some satisfactory calibration. Our national security agencies run the risk of being marginalized and ultimately irrelevant and ineffectual with grave consequences for national security. Eschewing the approach taken by authoritarian regimes to data collection and usage by no means reveals the proper path to be taken, as any decision would be deeply linked to the historic roles of government and the private sector in each country. The approach in Western Europe, with close cooperation between public and private sectors, might seem inappropriate if not impossible in America. For two examples, consider the integrated cyber centers in Britain and the level of government involvement in private sector data usage under the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. And you can click on that to get further information. I'm just going to hover over it. You can read it real quickly or pause the video. Would the American business community accept that model, and would our national politics permit its adoption? Paradoxically, the global cyber threat and the overall challenges presented by the digital revolution may propel national security agencies of many countries to work together, but they may find closer cooperation difficult in practice, as the balance between public and private sectors will vary greatly from nation to nation. Finally, our nation will have no choice but to harness the collective capabilities of the government and the private sectors to address the combined technological and economic threats posed by China. For the first time since the United States became a global power, it must now confront an adversary that presents not merely a political or military threat, but also an existential economic one. But in the latter area, the playing field is not level, as China advances its national strategic goals through a unified effort harnessing its government and its business sectors, the latter being a mix of private and state-sponsored endeavors, while our strategic goals are seen as the responsibility of the federal government, with our private sector largely free to pursue its capitalistic interests as it sees fit. The almost inescapable fact that China's economy will surpass ours in size has obvious national security implications, but two circumstances present special challenges for our national security community. The obvious one is that China continues to seek economic and military superiority through cyber theft from our government, defense industrial base, and academia. The second is that our National Security Agency, for the first time, must amass the talent and system to understand not simply a military challenge, but also challenges across a broad range of technology and global finance issues. The capacity for such understanding currently resides principally in the private sector and our universities, not the federal government. Both of those circumstances will force the government and private sector to work together in unprecedented, coordinated, and mutually supportive ways if we are to rise to the challenge posed by China. That will require changes in not only attitudes on both sides, but also laws to permit greater collaboration. The digital revolution is at least partly responsible for another disruptive effect on the relationship between governments and the private sector, namely the almost complete globalization of economic forces. That capital is now a global commodity shows the relative shortcomings of a nationalistic approach to protect vital assets. Most Western democracies have some rules to regulate foreign investment in critical industrial sectors. That capital is now a global commodity shows the relative shortcomings of a nationalistic approach to protect vital assets. Most Western democracies have some rules to regulate foreign investment in critical industrial sectors. In the United States, the Chinese have figured out that it is easy to sidestep the strictures of the Committee on Foreign Investment in nationally sensitive industries, simply by investing in startups and other ventures that have access or insight into critical technologies, or by working in university research labs to the same end. This may well be another factor weakening the role of nation states in providing security and tilting the balance of power toward the private sector, which is in a better position to police unwanted investments and intellectual property theft. As if all this is not disconcerting enough, the fourth implication is that the internet can have a pernicious effect on our democracies, where adversaries can take advantage of our freedoms and interfere in our societal and governmental institutions. The painfully obvious fact is that the internet affords everyone a communications capability. In the absence of a commonly accepted authority, whether it be a trusted government or a curated news source, the internet permits lies and evil to be spread with almost no check. A world in which effective deception in almost every venue and media outlet is possible vastly complicates the duties of government and societal institutions. Even if a nation were to control its own citizens' activities, information, whether accurate or not, knows no national boundaries. We all recognize this decentralizing and delegitimizing force, and there is no need to elaborate on it here. Worth appreciating in this context, however, is the governmental agencies with a national security mission are going to find it vastly more difficult to maintain the necessary trust, respect, and support of a democratic populace in this environment, jeopardizing not only their ability to obtain resources from society, but also in the end their very mission. Indeed, the state of affairs of fundamental uncertainty and doubt that will be facilitated by the misuse of digital technology may well make it more difficult to maintain foreign alliances, which, after all, are based on trust, precisely at a time, paradoxically, when global cooperation is required to counter malicious activity. In short, and perhaps most critical to appreciate, the fourth implication of the digital revolution is that it will make dealing with the first three implications all the more problematic. Putting these four implications together, coping with unprecedented technological change, adapting to a world of unceasing cyber conflict, navigating concepts of privacy and the power that comes with access to big data in the hands of the private sector, and countering the insidious and pernicious effects of the delegitimization afforded by the malign use of the internet, yields at least two imperatives, both of which are transformational. The first imperative is that our national security agencies must quickly accept this forthcoming reality and embrace the need for significant changes to address these challenges. This will have to be done in short order, since the digital revolution's pace will soon outstrip our ability to deal with it, and it will have to be done at a time when our national security agencies are confronted with complex new geopolitical threats. Much of what needs to be done is easy to see: developing the requisite new technologies and attracting and retaining the expertise needed for that forthcoming reality. What is difficult is executing the solution to those challenges, most notably including whether our nation has the resources and political will to effect that solution. The roughly $60 billion our nation spends annually on the intelligence community might have to be significantly increased during a time of intense competition over the federal budget. Even if the amount is indeed so increased, spending additional vast sums to meet the challenges in an effective way will be a daunting undertaking. Fortunately, the same digital revolution that presents these novel challenges also sometimes provides new tools, AI for example, to deal with them. The second imperative is we must adapt to the unavoidable conclusion that the fundamental relationship between government and the private sector will be greatly altered. The national security agencies must have a vital role in reshaping that balance if they are to succeed in their mission to protect our democracy and keep our citizens safe. While there will be good reasons to increase the resources devoted to the intelligence community, other factors will suggest that an increasing portion of the mission should be handled by the private sector. In short, addressing the challenges will not necessarily mean that the national security sector will become massively large, with the associated risk of insufficiency, insufficient coordination, and excessively intrusive surveillance and data retention. A smarter approach would be to recognize that as the capabilities of the private sector increase, the scope of activities of the National Security Agency could become significantly more focused, undertaking only those activities in which government either has a recognized advantage or must be the only actor. A greater burden would then be borne by the private sector. For example, our society could consider greater coordination between government and the private sector in advancing national security strategic goals, such as development of quantum computing capabilities, specific requirements for the private sector to share, with appropriate safeguards, proprietary data and technology with the government where directly relevant to national security, or a duty to notify government of the details of cyber incidents. Perhaps we should rekindle the discussion over a national service obligation to help supply technical expertise to the government across a broad range of fields, or otherwise create some arrangement to make such expertise available to government, rather than the current model in which the private sector often lures away government-trained talent. The point here is not to advocate for any of these, simply to say our policymakers need to be examining alternatives if we are to close the forthcoming technology gap. Although I have sketched out some of the more troublesome implications of the digital revolution for the national security sector, it is not in the spirit of forecasting doom, but rather to sound an alarm. Our innovative and entrepreneurial society affords us a unique advantage in dealing with these implications. Moreover, no adversary should ever underestimate the extraordinary capabilities of our armed forces and intelligence community, like those keeping watch at the National Security Operations Centers. Their prowess and resilience will be key in addressing future challenges, but it would be a mistake to rely on these strengths alone. Surmounting the transformational challenges posed by this fourth industrial revolution will require not merely resources and creativity from both the public and private sectors, but also, more critically, a level of concentrated national political will that may be made all the more difficult to achieve by the very attributes of the digital revolution rushing toward us. And so this article gives you a well-rounded perspective on the technology that is here and that is coming, and the rapid changes that are coming. So not only does Trump have to deal with bringing down the cabal, but he also has to deal with the transition of this amazing technology that's coming. You're talking about the ability to heal diseases, just as Trump said, we're going to eradicate AIDS here in the next 10 years. You're talking about things that aren't in our minds comprehensible at this point. Things that will change dramatically, save lives and all these other things, but at the same time, high risk of cyber threat and attacks and data mining and all sorts of things that have a potential of flaring up during this process of change as we shift over to these new technologies. Quantum computing is going to be our future no matter what happens. Okay, that's something people are just going to have to deal with it. You're going to have a quantum government, and a lot of the authority and power is going to shift down to the private, to us. You see how this is all working, and so you have a whole new type of government that is going to come out of all of this. It's the whole point of bringing this article to you. You're not talking about a government that you've been used to all your life. You're talking about a whole new era. With quantum computing, if there is transparency, then you're talking about a righteous earth coming about in the near future. Okay? But we have to get the first things done, which is to bring down the satanic cult that is earthwide, that is controlling all of the nations and has been keeping everyone under these illusions of sorcery and witchcraft. What is witchcraft, guys? It's spell casting. What is spell? Spelling. It's words. It's how words are used, definitions of words, syntax of words, capitalization, punctuation, grammar of words. You see how they do all these things. That's what sorcery, witchcraft, and necromancing, talking to the dead, raising of the dead spirits, and the illusionary works or the illusionists' operations that they do, and all these different things have to be taken down and be done away with once and for all for us to move forward in these technologies. So, guys, I hope this has helped you out in some way, form, or fashion. Like I said, I'm going to be off and on with the videos right now as I try to get things worked out. I got to get this surgery done and completed, guys. One way or another, I have to. I've got to get back to work. It doesn't matter if I put out 62 videos in a month or if I put out 20 videos a month. It used to be you could go on YouTube and you could actually make a very decent living on YouTube, $1,000, maybe $2,000 a month if you have enough subscribers, what have you. Nowadays, if you're telling the truth and it's against their narrative, then you're not going to be making anything but about maybe $70, $80 a month, even if you're putting out 100 videos and 2,000 hours worth of work. It doesn't matter to them. So this is where we are right now, guys, and I don't have a choice in the matter. I have got to figure out how to get this financing. I got to get my ankle worked on so I can get back to work and get back to having a life and being able to afford my bills and all those kinds of things. So, guys, just deal with me over the next few weeks and so while I get everything worked out, and I'll be making the videos as often as I can. No worries about that. Just please deal with me over the next few weeks, month or two, or whatever it takes. But I got to get this done. So, guys, I love you guys. Get in the Word, stay in the Word, get the Word in you. Most important thing you can possibly do. And remember, other than the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the two most important things are love and truth. Always will be. And then after that, peace and justice against those who want to do wickedly.